why are we doing this pandemic response planning? Well, when I canvassed folks about having this meeting, they said it's the only topic we're interested in talking about. And what's really interesting with this is that we have essentially a unique situation. Pandemic planning typically focuses on the health aspects. We have a situation where we have two areas. We need to focus on the health and the economic areas. So we have these two important areas to deal with. And what I'd like to do is take you through this presentation and give you some material because and some of this has come out of some of the feedback I've been getting from RTO 12 Explorer's Edge because they are getting bombarded by members who are falling through the cracks. They're not covered by a lot of the programs. They have unique issues being seasonal businesses. And so some of the information which I'll take you through is things that are relevant to our community and how we want to respond, particularly because there's an underlying feeling that essentially the government is going to do too little, too late for our community. A lot of our requirements are somewhat unique in the rural areas, and it just does not seem to be on the top of the radar screen. Government's doing an excellent job, all the various governments, of focusing on large companies, focusing on city situations. And so areas such as broadband and the areas in terms of our seasonal businesses and issues seem to be falling through the cracks, and hopefully they'll get to this. But most of them, by the time they get to it, may be too late if we don't do something in our communities. What I would like to do is take you through four things. One of the top questions businesses are asking us is, how long will this pandemic last? And governments are not willing to give an answer. This is worse for some of them, and at least give us a range to work from. So I'll take you through some of the information on that may help our businesses and our communities start to address this question. Secondly, who are our at-risk population groups, and what are we as a community doing to help them? Thirdly, how do we actually do pandemic response planning? What are some of the steps that we could be doing in our communities to address this? And the fourth one is, how are we going to, once the health issue has peaked, how do we re-enter the marketplace from both a health and an economic point of view? And there's unfortunately some serious issues which we need to start thinking about sooner rather than later. So unfortunately, this is more of a doom and gloom, but I find when you take people through the doom and gloom, once they understand the worst case, it almost lifts some of the burden off your shoulders, because now you have something you can get your head around and start planning for. How long will this last? Essentially, I've given you 6 different data points to give you some idea how long this could last. I'll talk a bit about what happened with the Spanish flu, which took 18 months. What happened with SARS versus the 2008 crash, and what happened there, where it took more than 12 months, particularly with a tourism focus, to start the recovery. The stock market, what's happened there, where you had a 2-year recovery, and those were on stock market crashes that are not nearly as dramatic as what we're potentially looking at now. The next one is, how long does it take the accommodation industry to get back on track? Because a number of business owners are worried about laying off staff because they may not get them back, and they're running into the issue of, if I pay my staff, I won't have enough money to feed myself. And so hopefully this will give them some information to make those decisions. Also, how long does it take you to get your revenue back? Tourism sectors are looking at massive discounts to try and get some customers, and what would be appropriate for this time and for how long, and also looking at the impact of 9/11. So those who have a seasonal tourism construction kind of focus will probably get more out of this than those that have a steady business that operates year-round. The Spanish flu, this is where a lot of the worry is about the second wave. So this first wave of the disease, which began in the spring of 1918, came back again in the fall and winter, which probably impacted worldwide health more than the first wave. And then there was a third wave right into 1919. So we're very worried that if the weather improves, and there's some data starting to show that the warmer climates are not seeing COVID-19 spread as fast as the colder climates where we are. And so if this is true and it has a seasonal effect, for those of you who think that we're done by the summer and we can come out and have a great time after that, there may be there may be some hesitation. Hockey fans, for those of you, I have a son who's a hockey fan. He didn't believe me. He Googled it. This is true. In 1919 is the only time that the Stanley Cup had ended with co-champions. And it was an unfortunate situation because this final was played in Seattle, which in October of 1918, everybody pretty much shut down because of the virus. By January, they were back up and things were back in session, and they had the Stanley Cups in competition in March. And in fact, it was a very exciting game, and each team had won 2 games, and they had to have this deciding game. But what had happened is the Canadians who'd moved down to Seattle, which was a 5-day train ride to go and play this game, were all taken down with the influenza, and many of them died. And so they didn't actually have enough Canadians to play the final game. So this can have serious consequences for us in terms of if this comes back and we have big sporting events or big group events. In terms of the tourism lines, there's essentially a blue line, which is giving you an indication of what happened with SARS. And then there's a green line with 2008 crash. And basically the bottom line is you're looking at a situation where SARS took place in March of 2003, and it wasn't until October of 2003 that you got some kind of an uplift in terms of the impact of SARS. And so this was not as bad from a health point of view. It was worse in terms of the impact on foreign tourists for a short period of time, but it recovered quickly than the financial impact, which is the green line, with the 2008 crisis. So even if the health comes back, because of the economic impact, the tourism will come back even more slowly because of the economic impact, potentially, than from the health impact. The Toronto Stock Exchange typically takes about 2 years to recover from these crashes. The little red line going down on the left-hand side there shows as of February, we were trending worse and faster than we've ever seen before. And so over the coming months, it'll be interesting to see how much it levels out and whether the recovery will be quick, like some economists are hoping, but more of them are starting to realize that this recovery may be far slower than we would like. This data shows you that the blue line, essentially it took 5 years for the number of people to get back into the accommodation business. And this is a better story than the air travel, which took 10 years. And, you know, the poor travel agents never recovered from that. We never have the same number of travel agents we used to have. So if our tourism impact is going to be up to 5 years on our accommodation and resorts and up to 10 years before our air travel gets back, we have some serious issues to address. I would mention at this point that we have been looking at the impact, the recovery programs put out by some of the other governments around the world. We've yet to have a package for our tourism seasonal operators, but in Australia, they have already rolled out some of these programs. In Tasmania, if you're a resort, you will get 3-year loans, no interest, to help you recover. So they're already taking a longer-term view with their hotel and resorts. Also, even though their Australian government is giving it cash with virtually no restrictions of up to $100,000 to businesses, their provinces or states, as they call them, are giving additional cash grants of $10,000 or more to businesses to try and get them back on track. Recovery room revenue, essentially the $65 an hour rate per room in the US, dropped to $54 during the crisis, the financial crisis. So that's about an 18% drop. And so not only are resorts looking at fewer folks coming, but also that they may have to drop their prices to be able to attract people to come. The 9/11, that impacted, and again, unfortunately, most of these are US data, but it's similar for us. Essentially, 9/11 saw the number of international visitors percent, which doesn't sound too, but it takes 5 years to recover 18% of those people, that 18%. And the airlines were really only showing their best years in November 2017. So that takes 10 years for the airlines to recover. If that happens again, that's going to have a huge impact on our lives. So that essentially is some data to help businesses and start to realize that the likelihood of us being open for business and all's good by May 1 is probably slim to none. And then if we look at our at-risk populations, essentially from a health point of view, we've got those who have compromised immune systems, we've got seniors, we've got special groups that we're trying to help. And then our at-risk businesses, if we want to, we're trying to flatten the curve for health, but if we're going to flatten the curve for economy, we need to address businesses, both those that are in seasonal situation and not just year-round, those who are at this moment non-essential, how do they get back in? And also we've got the problem of households where everybody's being asked to stay home if they can. We've got households with seniors, the youth, health workers, unemployed, etc. So this poses some interesting challenges. This is what a normal pandemic scale looks like, these for at-risk populations. If you look at this, this is very much focused on health. And this is what the US does. They have various tiers, what occupational groups you are, what your risk rates are, etc. This has limited use for us in our environment because we have to also take into account the economic overlay. What we have is the typical pandemic steps at the bottom: investigate, recognize, initiate, accelerate, decelerate, and preparation. And the blue peak tells us the kind of health scenario. What we don't have with most pandemic plans is what's the economic impact, which is the brown dotted line, which shows that it's going down, and it's going down fast, and the recovery will be a much longer time frame. So we're dealing with a double whammy here. And so it's important, the sooner we realize this is not just a health issue, and it may be as bad or worse from an economic point of view, we need to build that into our planning. So what are at-risk populations in Parry Sound Muskoka? PMCN, this is our area of focus. We're focusing on Parry Sound and Muskoka. There are about 100,000 residents in Parry Sound Muskoka. We have about 80,000 seasonal residents. So that green circle there, the 100,000 residents. If we now break it out, we have essentially 40,000 permanent resident homes. 11,000 of those have single people staying in them. So who's keeping an eye and helping them? We have about 7,000 of our 40,000 are renters. We have 27,000 seasonal homes, and people are being encouraged not to come to those seasonal homes yet, but some are here already. In fact, quite a significant number are already up here. In terms of the age groups, we've got probably 25,000 people out of our population are in the 65 plus age group, and we have more than 3,000 in the plus 80 age group. And so what are we doing to check on these folks and look after them and see if they need help? In terms of our businesses, we've got about 7,000 businesses and self-employed people. How many of these businesses have closed? Did a quick estimate based on the level of categories. While across Ontario, we may have 10 to 20, maybe 30% of businesses closed. We have a high distribution of retail, resort, and seasonal businesses. So we may actually find that up to half our businesses or more may already be closed, not 10 or 20% like some of the big cities. We have about 45,000 employees. How many of these have been laid off? If we have mostly female population of folks, we could have layoffs of at least half our workforce, which could mean we've got 22,000 people that are essentially laid off. How do we deal with each of these different groups? How do we help them? These are important factors for each community to be starting to worry about, because there's a limit to what the province can do as a whole or the federal government can do as a whole. Basically, I just broke down the numbers to say, for those of you who are really numbers fans, how did I come up with these numbers? I looked at the Canada population. I looked at how many workers there were. I looked at Muskoka Parry Sound, the proportion to figure out how many of our workers are public sector workers that are probably okay and not laid off. How many of ours are self-employed? How many are private sector employees, etc., so that you can get an idea of the kinds of numbers and how they came up. And what does this mean in April if, say, 10% were laid off? What if it was 20% by May? What if it was 30% by June? And how are we going to be able to help these numbers of folks, particularly as a lot of these folks are struggling to get support and are not currently covered by government programs. There was an article in the paper this morning. As far as they can tell, there's at least 1.2 million Canadians that are not covered by any of this. So proportionally, there's at least 2,500 sitting in our community that have no coverage at all. They fall through the cracks for some reason of the existing programs. What are the business owners trying to grapple with? On the left is a pyramid, a green pyramid, where typically in the good times at the bottom, most of your money comes in revenues. You would have some working capital, which is receivables. These are customers that haven't paid you yet. And then you would have your payables. These are your suppliers you have to pay, etc. And that would help manage your working capital, as they call it, the cash flow for the business. If you needed some more help, you typically had a loan, and then you had your savings at the top of the pyramid. What's happening is businesses are getting slammed on 4 levels at the same time. Your revenues are shrinking, you have less working capital, you're being asked by the government to take on more loans, and or your banks are offering you more loans, which puts you worse in a worse case if you take on these loans, and you start using up all your savings. So what's happening is a lot of business owners know the dangers of taking on too much debt. Also, the feedback we're getting from a lot of businesses is the government is not owning up to responsibility for this pandemic by giving you a loan. If they give you cash or a grant, they're taking responsibility. If they're giving you a loan, they're putting the burden of this pandemic on the shoulders of business folks. So there's a pushback in terms of being able to take loans. Some businesses have no choice, but this will, for some cases, make things worse, not better. The kind of quote going around, the only cheese that is free is the cheese in the mousetrap. So I know a number of professionals are warning businesses that these kinds of loans and these kinds of rules and regulations, which are being decided after the fact, would come back and hurt a lot of businesses. So if you can avoid taking these loans and taking some of these current programs, businesses are being asked to think very carefully about that. If you look at the most sophisticated businesses, what they do in a tough time is they typically sit down and they figure out what things can I control and what things can I not control. And they will typically put together 1, 2, or 3 scenarios and try and figure out how much cash will I have if I don't change my plans. This problem is over in, say, 3 months. That's scenario A, plan A. But if I don't change my plans and this thing lasts 6 months, not 3 months, how much cash will I have left over? And the same with scenario C for plan A. If I don't change, how much cash will I have left over in 9 months? And then if I cut my costs in plan B, say 15%, what will that do for me? Or in plan B, cut my costs 25%. In this model here, even in plan B, I cut my costs 25%, and if this lasts 9 months, I may be in trouble. So businesses typically only have 1, 2, maybe 3 months of cash flow to be able to continue, particularly if they take a heavy revenue cut. And so these are the kinds of things the more sophisticated businesses are starting to address. This is the one where our business is focused. What we have is businesses tend to be stuck in one of these 5 areas. One, there are those who are still trying to figure out what's happened. They're in the resolve. They're trying to deal with the immediate problems. Some of them are now starting to move into managing their cash and trying to figure out how they're going to, the resilience, how they're going to get through this. And then the most advanced are already starting to say, how am I going to come out of this? What's my plan to get recovery going? And we don't have a lot of folks worrying about 4 and 5 at this stage. But to try and get your businesses that you support to start getting beyond step 1, starting to spend time on step 2 and step 3 would be extremely helpful. How do we do pandemic response planning? Essentially, how do we scope this? How do we set a direction? What are our priorities going to be? What kind of task force, what kind of people should be involved, and what kind of things should we measure? What kind of dashboard should we have? Problem with pandemics is when you look at this pyramid, pandemics need to cover everything. Yet most of us, if we have insurance in our house, we only worry about home insurance. Or if we have a business, we might worry about disaster planning, or we may have business interruption insurance. Or if we just focus on the various facilities and equipment we have, we may only have essentially repairs or recovery of equipment or damage or fire type insurance. Most of our municipal and government organizations have spent tons of time and money and dollars emergency planning. But typically this emergency planning is typically dealing with things that are much more narrow in scope. So a lot of these community emergency planning doesn't have to deal with the wide range of business issues. They don't have to deal with the wide range of homes across the whole community. The fire or flood, particular homes, businesses, and or services in that immediate area need support. So this pandemic response, if you're going to do it right, has a huge number of areas that need to be covered off quickly and effectively. What we're seeing happen now is we've got the dotted lines. We have a situation where things have deteriorated. We're now trying to get out of it. And you'll notice every province is doing something different. Every municipality is doing something different. Every chamber of commerce is doing something different. We're all running in different directions, trying to figure out how to solve the problems in our communities. We need to agree on our priorities. We need to have the same end game, even if we have different paths to get there. And so we have situations in our rural areas which don't seem to be on the radar screen of our provincial and federal governments yet, or at a level that can give the community some support. So the onus is really on the business leaders, on the community leaders, and the municipal government leaders in each area to start looking at ways they can help the community. Broadband is an issue, seasonal business is an issue, and also we are subject to the same lockdown as the big cities, even though we may not have the same problems as them. So what do? The first thing is we need to, as a community, decide who's the boundaries of our community. We need to figure out what are our priorities. Is the most important thing for this spring just compliance, safety, shutdown? Or is it to do cash flow? Is it to help people with food? Or what are those top 2 or 3 priorities that are important for our community that we need to be able to do that? So that's the top triangle, the priorities. These priorities will change over time. So during the spring, we may have one set of priorities, and by the summer, we may have a whole lot of different issues. We let some folks move around and get up because the shutdowns and the current mode are just not practical for the long term. What about the problem of getting food? Those of you who've been to grocery stores have noticed the order of food, that we're having trouble getting migrant workers to come into Canada. A lot of our food production won't happen. Can we get greenhouses going? Can we get food production going in our local communities so we can at least get through the winter? These kind of issues may be priorities by the summer. By the fall, we may have a different set of issues. We may be getting ready for another COVID-19 wave, or there may be some selective travel, and what is that and what can we do? And there's those who need to get through the winter. How long before a vaccination is available, and how long will it take to wrap up, and will it be here in time before next summer? Bill Gates was on the news this morning talking about the speed at which the vaccinations will be ready. Realistically, he was hopeful that they will come sooner, but he's realistically saying from now, 18 months from now is probably the earliest. So the fall of 2021 is probably the earliest that we'll have a vaccine. And only after that, and we've got it to go across the world, will people be able to open up significantly. Who's going to set all these priorities? This is where you need a task force. What we're finding is the community leaders have some information, business owners have some information, you've got some of the government folks have information, and we don't have a way to pool that quickly and effectively. And different communities are seeing different issues. For example, in Gravenhurst, they've already run into situations where people literally don't have the money for food. So the food banks are building up, and they're looking at providing additional dollars to help these folks get through this time already. So different communities are going to have different issues, and how do you address these issues? Because if you're waiting for a provincial or federal solution, it may come, but it may not come in enough time. Once you've got the task force, the priorities, what are the things that are important for our community? And what's the way that we can quickly flag this? Green is, don't worry about it. Amber is, we're working on it. Red is, we got to do something with it. So what are the various boxes of our infrastructure, and what things can we deal with now, or what things have to be dealt with in the future? So infrastructure, whether it's fire, police, roads, etc. How can we quickly figure out for our community what are the issues, if there are any? And if they're all green, great, let's move on to the next level. Next level down is communications. Broadband's a real issue for us, not so much in some of the towns, but certainly in the rest of the community. What can we do in terms of mail, phone? Air travel is obviously not happening, vehicles, etc. So what are the communication tools we have, and how are we using those, and how effective are those for our community? The same idea with equipment. What do we do about things such as food, businesses that are trying to export, businesses that are trying to import, getting healthcare equipment moved around? So these kinds of issues may be issues across the province, but they may not be issues in our community. What facilities do we have? Our schools are shut down, but as we have a situation with some of our children, A, don't have computers, B, don't have decent internet connections, C, used to sit in the parking lot at the library or go into the library to do their homework, can't do that anymore. So these are the kinds of issues that come up that may be specific to our community. So being able to flag quickly what are the things in terms of facilities and what can we do about it. The business community, what are the biggest issues for business community here? It may be great for those that have online customers and getting customer deliveries, but what about the problem of trying to get these to come back to work? What about cash flow? About trying to comply with these new regulations which change every day? So there may be things that the business community needs to focus on in our area, and how do we flag those and help them with those issues? What do we do for our homes? We've got some homes that essentially have only one person in it. We have some homes with seniors. How do we check on making sure that if they need help, we can do that? So these things are very important. Just to the re-entry. So having got through all of that, once we've got our pandemic planning happening across our community, what are some of the things that we need to start thinking about for our specific community to get the re-entry going? Now, some of the kinds of programs that other communities had was food stamps. I know in Italy, their government rollout of funding has been so slow, they've actually had to develop food stamps for the first time ever to be able to feed people. They have people going into supermarkets and refusing to pay. If you don't deal with this in some of the third world countries, you have food riots. So we have a serious number of people that literally don't have enough food. And so what are we going to do about those? Tourism from emerging markets. Is this a window where we could suddenly attract people from a different area who may travel sooner than our current traditional tourists? And then essentially, there's a great article in Fast Company magazine about a 4-point re-entry plan for the US, and some of those pieces of advice may be some things that we should think about for our community. Local food stamps. Some communities do downtown dollars, some way that you can help people get food or get emergency supplies. The food stamp in the US program is now called the STAMP program, and they're looking at expanding that in the US. This was something was triggered after the Spanish flu area. It went away when the war, World War II started, and they were able to essentially provide enough jobs for everybody, and then it came back again. What's showing up is China, India, and Latin America have they make up nearly 40% of the world's travelers now. So if we do get air travel back and it comes back quicker than some of the folks have suggested, do we try and refocus on trying to bring people from Europe? Do we try and be, or do we say, in fact, we may get people from China, India, or Latin America far faster because this is a community that's ready to travel. So when we want to re-enter the international travel market, should we actually use this as an opportunity to pivot our marketing? In terms of the 4-point re-entry plan, essentially it arounds some way to do temperature checks or the equivalent of that. What kind of personal protective equipment are you going to have when you get back into the marketplace? What kind of social distancing will we have once we go back in the marketplace? And what kind of personalized service provisions will need to be in place? Temperature checks, some way that you can do this. This is already happening in Singapore, South Korea, these kinds of places. We may have to have some kind of temperature check or equivalent when you go into offices, office buildings, schools, arenas, municipal offices. These may all have to have these kinds of facilities in place before they're allowed to open to the public. Essentially in Wuhan, they've unsealed Wuhan. They had a 76-day lockdown. But if not, you've got to wear a mask and a suit. So what kind of masks and suits do you have to travel after this lockdown? There's some more detail on what's happening in Wuhan. You've got long lines because people have to go through screening procedures to go in and out of government buildings. You've got problems where if you come out of Wuhan, you've got to have passed a test. But if you want to go into Beijing, you have to pass another test and could go through another 14-day quarantine. Are we going to have the same issue that once we come out of this, if you want to go to Quebec or you want to go from Toronto to Ottawa, you're going to have these kinds of bizarre problems. Even though they've reopened Wuhan, the schools are still not open. We're going to have some kind of formal document that allows you to go traveling to say that you are, you're safe. Again, color-coded. They have, can I get a green card, which means I can go anywhere, or a red card means I can only go to these following places. In terms of personal protective equipment, the frontline workers need a lot of this stuff, but what's going to happen is grocery clerks, warehouse pickers, delivery workers, more and more people in the community are going to have these different kinds of masks and gloves, etc., until this vaccine is in place and we feel safe again. What's going to happen is you're probably going to have municipal regulations that change how your office designs will be, how your factories are designed, how your retail stores will have to be designed. You're going to have situations where if you do hair or nails or fitness, you may have to do that in people's homes. You may not be able to go back to your current facilities on the main street. You may see for the musicians and performers, they may have to do house concerts because open air, the large facilities may not be suitable until the vaccines are in place. Restaurants and bars may actually find that they have to do small caterings in people's homes because their restaurants and bars won't be available in a traditional way. Some of the bizarre things that are going on here, they did that in 1918. We've got all kinds of suggestions what kind of things could be vaccines. There they're using enemas, whiskey, bloodletting. We've got all these kind of crazy ideas. But the folks who really know tell us that a sound vaccine probably won't be around for quite some time. The social distancing, realistically, folks, is a year to a year and a half of this. So we're looking at the fall of 2001 before we can start to unscramble some of the social distancing. There's a role for chambers of commerce and associations and providers of services. If you have to redesign your office as a result of this, or your shop or your business to cope with this, this may be incurring a whole bunch of costs. You may need loans, you may need advice on how to do all these kind of changes of plans. And so this will trigger a demand on us as providers to this community on how we're going to deal with it. Some of the more creative solutions they did on page 44, they believed that open air was the right solution. So we may have barbershops and hairdressing salons in the open air in the future. So we may have to have church services in the open air if that is proven to be some way to mitigate this. So there may be some bizarre things happening until the vaccine is in place. Finally, in terms of personalized service provision, it's highly unlikely conferences other than Zoom or other kinds of means like that are unlikely to happen until such time as there's a vaccine in place. Also on slide 46, there's a poem written about how life changed when this was there, and a lot of this sounds very familiar to us already who've been locked down. So there's going to be a whole change in the way we look at the world and the way we do things as a result of this. What's the next step? I'm encouraging this group to give some serious thought. How are we going to do this pandemic response planning in our community? Communities that don't do it are going to be potentially suffering more than those that do. Who do we get around the table? How do we get our committees together? How do we address this issue? This is something that we as a group should be lobbying hard for folks to consider. So in summary, how long will this pandemic last? I'm suggesting that it's going to be probably a lot longer than we think. 2, how we're going to look after our at-risk populations, because given so many other priorities, relying on the province or the feds to do this may be a problem. And how do we do our pandemic response planning? And what kinds of things do we need to start thinking about to get ready for re-entry?